feel like I have to do this. Let's pray. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. O heavenly King, the Comforter, the Spirit of truth, who art everywhere and fillest all things, treasury of blessings, and giver of life, come and abide in us, and cleanse us from every impurity, and save our souls, O good one. I'm going to start off tonight by reading a quotation from St. Paisios of Mount Athos that kind of leads into the second thing I'm going to talk about tonight before we get to our text. And this was a quote. This was actually sent out by my spiritual father. He kind of does daily readings for all of his hundreds and hundreds of spiritual children around the world. But this is about civilization and about, in a sense, the environment that we live in. And I'm just going to read the whole thing and then sort of explain while I'm reading it. Civilization is a good thing, but in order to be beneficial, the soul must also be civilized. Otherwise, we are in for a total disaster. St. Cosmos Aitolos said, "Evil will come from those who are educated." Despite the fact that science has advanced so much and made tremendous progress, when it tries to help people, it often ends up harming them unintentionally. God allows man to do whatever he wants, but when we don't listen to him, we end up in disaster. The very things we create destroy us. What have we achieved in this century with our civilization? We have driven people mad and have polluted the atmosphere and environment. When a wheel leaves its axis, it spins aimlessly out of control. Similarly, when people stray from God's harmony, they are tormented. In the past, people suffered from wars. Today, they suffer from civilization. Then, war made them leave their cities and go to the villages where they lived off a small field. Now, on account of civilization, they will abandon the cities because they can no longer live in them. In the past, wars brought about death. Now it is civilization that brings about diseases. That's the quote. And I hope you heard in that a lot of the themes that we've been talking about, not only with Ian McGilchrist, but with Charles Taylor. Notice that science has made progress, but when we lose the harmony of God, we end up harming ourselves unintentionally through our education, through our civilization, and oftentimes through our very science. And that's essentially what the argument that McGilchrist is making. Why? Because when we stop paying attention to how all things relate to God, we will innately misuse the world. And when we innately misuse the world, it will reach back and harm us. It will bite us. We're grabbing the snake by the tail. We forgot that the head's going to whip around. And that's essentially the world that we've created. And this is essentially McGilchrist's argument, that we've chosen to pay attention to the world through a very narrow lens of what knowledge is, of how we approach truth, of what we think of reality. But what the saint is saying here, Elder Paisios, is that we need God's harmony. We need the soul to be, quote, civilized. We need to pay attention to the big picture. And here, this is just, I think, just incredible. The very things we create destroy us. It was, in the past, people suffered from wars. Today, they suffer from civilization. And it's civilization that makes them leave their places and go elsewhere. And that leads to the next one. That to me is like, wow, that just captures so perfectly a lot of what we're talking about in this course and why we need to think of ourselves in terms of how we perceive reality and how we pay attention to the divine and the sacred in the world. How many of you happened to catch 60 Minutes on Sunday night? They did a whole segment on the country of Bhutan. Anyone see that? Nobody saw that? Really magnificent, again, for exactly the reasons we're talking about. Bhutan is this small country in between China and India. It's in the Himalayan mountains. It's very isolated. It has tended to hide in the mountains from its big, powerful neighbors, India and China. And Bhutan is a completely enchanted country. We talked about before how much the texts we're dealing with here are dealing with the Western mindset and that other parts of the world remain enchanted. Bhutan is a wonderful example of this. And what's interesting about Bhutan is it's very intentionally so. They were interviewing a man, I think he said he was 65, and when he was a young man in his 20s, there were still no roads in Bhutan. They got everywhere by horseback. It is an intentionally medieval society, and its medievalism has lasted all the way into really into late post-modernity. The people, by both tradition and cultural expectation, continue only to dress in the traditional garb of their forebearers. So to us, it would look like they're all dressing up for like a special holiday and wearing ethnic clothing. That's what they wear every day. Every building and home that they build in Bhutan is built according to the ancient methods and with the ancient materials. It is filled, it's a Buddhist country, it's filled with shrines and temples and places of prayer everywhere. And one of the things that really struck me is they're in the Himalayas. Who lives on mountaintops? We know this from the many times that I've said this, right? The gods, all right? So the Buddhists believe this. The Buddhists believe that the mountains are sacred, and therefore, by law, they absolutely outlaw mountain climbing. And you're not allowed to climb on the mountains. You can go trekking in Bhutan. You can go sort of hiking and backpacking and that sort of thing. But you can't do technical rock climbing and scale the peaks. And the representative who was explaining this saying, our gods live on the mountains. They are sacred for us. You don't go scrambling all over the place where the gods live. What a marvelous thing to hear, even though we would say that those are, those gods are a little bit iffy from our perspective. But notice the sacredness, notice the sense of enchantment. And then he said something else that was very interesting. He said, the mountains aren't something to be conquered, they're to be respected and revered. And that really struck me because when you think about our entire Western mindset, our whole attitude towards nature, it has improved lately over the last several decades. But oftentimes the Western European mindset, especially coming out of the Enlightenment, was that nature is something to be conquered. We are to impress the superiority of humanity upon the natural world. And that's essentially what mountain climbers are doing. They are conquering the mountain. They are testing themselves to see if they can scale to the heights. And compare that mindset where they don't even allow mountain climbing on their peaks. Compare that to the condition of Mount Everest today. If you've ever seen anything about Mount Everest, it is a garbage dump. It's too high to haul garbage out. So everything that goes up stays. And it is literally, base camp of Mount Everest is a field of garbage. There is human feces everywhere because there's no one to pack it out. There are dead bodies lying on Mount Everest, and now that temperatures are warming up more and more, those bodies are more and more exposed. And so if you want to conquer Mount Everest, that includes today walking past dead bodies. Some of them you would know their names, and if you've seen the movie Everest, those bodies are still up there. They're still lying right where they were left. And so just think about the difference of mentality. Think about the mindset of the sort of the Wild West, where people would go on trains and they'd see fields filled with bison, and for sport, they would shoot the bison from the train to see how many they could drop, and then just leave the bodies. The train, I mean, there's never any intention of eating the animal. It was just, let's see how many we can kill to show how superior we are to nature. Man versus nature is very much a feature of the modernist mindset that we've been talking about. It's very much a feature of the left hemisphere way of relating to the world, the manipulation, the control. I am on top. I'm not seeing how the whole flows together. Um, so that really, really struck me. But then they said something else. And this relates to what St. Paisios was just talking about, how civilization today makes us leave the cities. Since the pandemic, Bhutan is going through a crisis in which many of their young people are leaving the country for economic reasons. Here's another feature of them. Like by law, 70% of Bhutan has to be under tree cover. You can't go in. So this is another example. If we're going to have a developer come in and build 300 new homes, what are they going to do? Clear cut the forest, take bulldozers, destroy the land, and put up boxes and call them homes, right? That's our American way. Like there's nothing sacred to our world. We just destroy whatever we feel like destroying for the sake of extraction, for the sake of value. So very, very different. But a lot of people are leaving because what they discovered was in the pandemic, it hit them hard. Even they're really subsistence farmers, most of them, craftsmen and subsistence farmers. And a lot of people in Bhutan are moving to Australia, which isn't that far away for them, but it's a place where they can go and get good jobs and have a different life. And there's that cross pressure we've talked about a lot over the totality of this course, that this is the civilization. It brings many things, and it brings temptations, it brings comforts, and sometimes you think, boy, here we are struggling, living this almost medieval style of life even today in Bhutan. We could move to Australia and join the Western economy. And a lot of them were doing that. And so the king of Bhutan has initiated a challenge to the people for them to work with him and figure out, how can we do this? And here's the question they asked openly, and my jaw dropped when they said it. Can development and growth coexist with sacred values? That's the question they're asking themselves in Bhutan. Can development and growth coexist with sacred values? Can they still have all of their sacred laws and traditions and sacred way of life, but still bring economic development and economic growth and improvement? One of the very interesting projects that they outlined, that again, it's like where they're trying to bridge a divide, almost literally, but they rely a lot on hydroelectric power, because they have a lot of rivers coming out of the mountains in Bhutan. And so they decided, well, we're going to build a new city, and it's still going to be absolutely traditional. It's still going to have all the trees. It's still going to be beautiful. It's still going to be peaceful and serene and have all these places of prayer. But boy, do we need to improve power. That's one of the limiters to growth and development, is power. How do you get more power? So they've agreed that they have to dam up one of their major rivers. This is a big deal, right? Because dams are notorious. They can produce hydroelectric power and really change the landscape, but they always have unintended consequences. You end up causing creatures to go extinct when you put a dam in, because rivers are flow, right? And every part of the river is touching every other part of the river at all times through the water. But what they're doing is different. They're building a huge dam. Like the scale of it was like, holy cow. But they're making it so that the dam itself isn't just a big concrete structure that blocks the water. They're building a structure that A, is beautiful, and B, instead of just being an engineering thing, it's a living thing. So the dam, the whole face of the dam has walkways and balconies and porticos. They're building Buddhist temples and prayer rooms right into the dam itself, so that you can climb and do all these stairs and pray and light candles and do all these things. And so they're trying to integrate something necessary for growth and development, but still honor their sacred way of life. And of course, usually the cultures like that are going to have river gods. And usually you're afraid, if you dam up the river, that the river god is going to be very, very upset with you, particularly in that part of the world. So it's very interesting. But can growth and development coexist with sacred values? And honestly, that's a wonderful capture of what we're talking about. And one of the things we can learn is we can look at how they live, and obviously we can say, boy, I'm not sure I would want to live that way. I'm used to the benefits of civilization that growth and development have given us here in America. I kind of felt this way about Georgia, to be honest. When we were in Georgia, there are parts of Georgia that feel almost medieval. They're very underdeveloped that way, and it's fascinating to go and to see all the churches, the Orthodox churches and the Orthodox monasteries, and to feel the history just like seeping right out of the ground. I'm not sure I'd want to live there, right? Or not that part of Georgia. And that's part of the cross pressure that they're experiencing. Boy, Australia is looking pretty good right now. We can live in an apartment and have a modern lifestyle, but they're trying to hold on to the sacred. And so it's interesting that even a country that has intentionally held on to its sacred values is now trying to ask, can we somehow balance that with both? And I think without question, if you are intentional, you could, but you better not leave your country in the hands of developers. And it doesn't sound like they're going to, but that's really the question, is whether or not you sort of give it up to economic development. That part of what's happened in the West, and I would say particularly as Americans, this is one of the things that makes us exceptional, is there's almost nothing sacred enough that we're not willing to sacrifice for growth and development. And we just have to admit that. That is true. That's just who we are as Americans. We will destroy just about anything if we can see dollar signs. And, we get benefits from it, and we get harm. And we live in that tension. And we all live in the tension. It's not one or the other. So the other thing I thought about here with that whole idea of the mountain is not to be conquered. Remember a few years ago, there was that dentist who paid, when he went to Africa, and he paid to have the privilege and excitement. They tied a male lion to a tree so he could shoot it and kill it, right? That's the same idea, this sort of like big game predator hunting, where the only real pleasure you're getting is the idea that you conquered the beast, right? Even when you tie the beast to a tree and then just shoot it like it's target practice, horribly violent, very, very disgusting. And yet for a lot of people, they're like, why not? And honestly, that's how the West has kind of functioned for a lot of our history. It's man over conquering nature. It's very much a feature. Moby Dick, read Moby Dick. That's the same idea, right? The whale representing the mystery of power from the ocean, and Ahab is the maniacal, I will conquer the whale at any cost. That's kind of who we are. So anyway, I hope that's helpful in terms of continuing to see that these things we're talking about, they're everywhere. They keep cropping up. Every time I sit down in the morning and do my spiritual reading, I'm like, ooh, I should read that at class. That's what we're talking about. But then it's like every day, if you're just adding on to the list, you can't keep doing that. And so at some point you have to stop. So today we're doing the second section here of we're in part 4 of McGilchrist and part 2 of part 2, where we are asking, this is sort of a chapter, Reasons, Claims on Truth. And I mentioned this, I'm kind of picking up where we left off a little bit. I mentioned this last week, but I wanted to continue with it and read, because I think it's really at the heart of the book. You kind of understand the whole book if you understand what he's talking about here. And here, do you remember last week I talked about this idea that that there's subjective truth and there's objective truth. And for a long time, I mean, when I was in seminary as a sort of evangelical Anglican, we spent a lot of time talking about objective truth. There used to be a book in that library, I've mentioned this too, by Father Anthony Conieris, and it literally was entitled, Whatever Happened to Objective Truth? Does anyone remember that? Right? This is idea where the world was saying nothing's true, you can make up, anything can mean whatever you want it to mean, which is true. I mean, that's kind of how many people think today. There's no ground or foundation to truth. And the sort of Christian, conservative, evangelical response is, there is objective truth, and we can know objective truth. And ironically, it's a statement that's very much in line with the scientific worldview, because the hard science also says there is objective truth, and we will measure it, and we will determine it through experiment and reproducible results and that sort of thing. And McGilchrist is saying that this whole idea is actually mistaken. And I think this is where it's really helpful. He said, it is the left hemisphere's process of apprehending the world that gives rise to the very idea of the subjective and objective, a false dichotomy. As I suggested in part 1, he writes, there is rather, as disclosed by the mode of the right hemisphere, a, quote, betweenness to reality, a world that comes into being for us, which, to paraphrase Wordsworth, we half perceive and half create. That doesn't mean that half is objective and half is subjective, or half real and half a fantasy. It means that the coming into being of the world is wholly and simply an encounter to which inevitably both parties contribute and in which both parties are real. Does that make sense to everybody, what he's saying there? In other words, rather than assuming that there's a world out there and there's perception inside our head, and that there's no movement in this, what he's calling this in-betweenness, that we live separately. See, this is a left hemisphere way of relating to reality. It's also a scientific way of relating to reality. This idea of radical otherness, okay? But because we're created, is another way of saying this, we participate in the world that we actively perceive. And therefore, the truth of that world is in the betweenness of what we perceive and what's being created in front of us. Not that it didn't exist the moment before, but that we are participating in it. In other words, our experience of reality is inescapably participatory and moving, not static. Right? It's not a static, you sit there and I sit here and then I observe you, all right? It's a movement, all right? Both parties are real. So, he says it's that the thing is a given in our very experience of it. That something is not an image, is not a shadow, not a representation of something else. In as far as it falls short, it's because this something is only ever partially given. And here, the something is the nature of reality here. It's only partially given because inevitably partially hidden. Partially given because inevitably partially hidden. He mentions it's like a Japanese Zen garden in which from any one viewpoint there is always at least one of the 15 stones in a Zen garden that cannot be seen. This doesn't imply that there is something we never see, just that there does not exist a viewpoint from which everything can be seen at once. And this starts to open up this idea of what it means to see and what it means to perceive. And our Lord Jesus Christ had something very, very specific to say about that, which I'm going to turn to in a moment. But I want to keep reading. Is everyone tracking with me? All right? Instead of thinking that there's either everything's subjective and we all get to make up whatever's true for me, or everything is objective and has nothing to do with me, what he's saying is reality is that we participate in it, we experience it, we half perceive and half create. And he's borrowing that from Wordsworth. But it's very, very true to our Christian understanding of the nature of reality, that man as a priest is meant to be participating in and completing the creation of all things. And that's what we're saying at the start of the liturgy. It is time for the Lord to act. And what do we mean by that? To make, to create, to complete creation with us, right? That's the parallel. That's the connection. Very exciting. All right, so he continues to clarify, I am not saying that all I can know is a simulacrum, the relationship of which to a reality that I can never know, I also can never know. I'm saying that what I know is real enough, but it is only what I am able to see from where I am, a tiny portion of the whole. And this is, again, seeing and humility are coming into play here. This differentiates a particular state, one that applies to each one of us but somewhat differently from the supposed deficiencies of a general state, one that applies to us all similarly. Not partially real, not but sorry, not partially real, but really partial, or better, wholly real and wholly partial. Not as is a landscape to a blind man's eye, but as is the living presence of the landscape. He's quoting Wordsworth here. Let me continue. He's quoting from a poem from Wordsworth, and he says, when he wrote those lines, he was able momentarily to transcend individual limitations and thereby pass on to us, his readers, the gift of seeing for a while what he saw. And this is oftentimes what the gift of art is. It's the gift of seeing. Whether it's visual art or poetry, the gift of art is the gift of transcending our individual limitations and imparting the gift of seeing to your audience or to the one who's reading. And here I want to bring in what Christ says about this. This is in John 9:39 and following. For judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and that those who see may become blind. Some of the Pharisees near him heard this, and they said to him, Are we also blind? Jesus said to them, If you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now that you say we see, your guilt remains. This is fascinating because what our Lord, and of course this also invokes Isaiah, the prophet, and this idea that the people seeing they do not see and hearing they may not hear. It's also something that he repeats about the parables. He speaks in parables so that seeing they may not see and hearing they may not hear. This has to do with perception, and it has to do with whether or not we're paying attention to the whole, right? And what McGilchrist is saying is that proper attention to reality implies that I understand in humility that I'm not seeing everything. That it's not partial. Reality isn't partial, but the part of it that I'm seeing is partial. Humility comes from realizing I don't know. I don't see all. I am not literally all-seeing. Only God is all-seeing, right? So the Pharisees have a way of relating to the law of Moses that has blinded them precisely to the God who gave the law to Moses. They want to insist that they know the law and that Jesus is the imposter, but Jesus is the author of the law. He is the God who passed it on. Their way of paying attention to the law has completely blinded them to the presence of God standing in their midst. Now that you say we see, your guilt remains, you see. But Jesus comes for others so that not seeing or being blind, they may see truly. And truly, it is the humble. It is those who don't claim to be the experts. It is those who don't claim to be without sin. It is those who say, like Peter, Depart from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man. They're the ones who see. And this is precisely the paradox built into the gospel that McGilchrist is identifying in terms of how our very brain structure works. The left brain wants to insist that it's right, wants to believe that having collected its data, it knows everything there is to know. It lacks humility. It lacks perspective. The right hemisphere is needed to come in and fill out and round out the nature of reality, which very much starts with humility. Silence and the practice of unknowing, a willingness to relinquish thoughts and focus on the name of God, requires the humility of knowing what it is and that it is you don't see. Does that make sense to everybody? Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's a good question. Well, I'll tell you first, he would not say that the brain is a machine. Um, and we talked about this a little bit, that he actually thinks it's really problematic that the field of physics has moved long past, gone way beyond the mechanized view of reality, but the field of biology still insists that the brain is a machine, consciousness is simply uh, one cog in the machine that we just haven't seen yet, and we'll eventually figure it out, and all those sorts of things. So he would push back on the idea that the brain is a machine. Um, yes, material and immaterial, or the is another way of saying what is seen and what is hidden, or what is veiled. And in fact, the chapter we're merging into is intuition, imagination, and the unveiling of the world. So yeah, what he's suggesting is that there are forces at work that are unseen, that there are, in a sense, immaterial, but no less real. This is crucial. No less part of the fabric of reality, that we need the whole thing in order to understand. And again, he's not, he is a scientist. He's not anti-science. He's not trying to pit poets against science at all. In fact, we'll see that in just a moment in terms of the role of intuition and imagination, both in science and in mathematics. Very, very interesting. And in poetry, by the way. But yeah, it's a recognition that we have privileged a certain way of viewing reality as being, this is trustworthy, and that's where we collect our data and we build logical step to step to construct our idea of what the truth is. Whereas there are other factors, and he calls that intuition and imagination, that are essential and are required for the knowledge of truth. And that these are not opposed to science, they're incorporated within science. We just act as if they're not, okay? There was another thing I was going to share, and I think this is another way of putting it. David Brooks, you all know who David Brooks is. He's sort of a journalist, commentator. He's written many books. Very smart, very thoughtful guy. And he wrote an article recently for The Atlantic, basically called How Harvard Broke America, I think it was. And I just watched an interview with him the other day. And I've seen actually a lot of this. There's this concern about higher education. Eileen isn't with us today, but I was going to ask her about this. This concern about higher education. But one of the things he points out is that, you know, about 70 years ago, if you were the son of an alumnus from Harvard, it was really easy to get into Harvard, right? You didn't have to have the grades. You didn't have to have all the activities and achievements or whatever. You were the son of an alumnus, you got in. And there was a kind of a shift in policy in higher education that said, you know, we have these elite institutions, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Penn, Stanford, et cetera, and we so empower the same families, the same blue-blooded Americans. We need to expand it, and so they developed a different way of using criteria of how you get into these schools. And the man who did this, the president of Harvard at the time, very much favored IQ tests. And so the idea of the SAT and the grades you have in high school are the basis for how you get into a school like Harvard. You can have, by the way, straight A's in all kinds of extra AP credits, but if your SAT scores is only a 1050, you're not getting in, right? You have to have really high SAT scores, which is to say a very high IQ, and very good grades. And paradoxically, what Brooks is arguing is, and it almost sounds like he was reading the Gilchrist, that they were favoring one kind of academic achievement, one kind of knowledge, at really the expense of everything else that makes up for a wisdom tradition amongst the people. Everything else, all the other ways that the human person can be gifted, and they're saying, no, that's not good enough to be elite. And it has been the case that to get to the hardest thing about Harvard is getting in, right? That's what Harvard grads have always said. And that once you're in, you're part of the club, and it's very easy to get your job at Goldman Sachs or wherever you want to go from there. Like, it's all a kind of a big old boys club that now includes the gals as well. But it really favors stacking the top the upper echelon with only one kind of achievement or one kind of success, and that he's arguing that that has imbalanced, in a sense, over the decades, not just because of Harvard, but of many schools, and many of them, the same thing as teaching to the test instead of teaching the whole person, teaching to the SAT. Schools, admissions departments have to game the system to rank higher on the U.S. News and World Report's college ranking issue, because if they don't, they sink down and they don't get the same number of applications, et cetera, et cetera. And it's all become this mess. And he's pointing out that we're all suffering for this. But it's the same argument. We're favoring one kind of thing. All right, I know we got started late, and I am going to check the time just because we had Litya tonight. One of the things in this next section that McGilchrist is doing is saying that, and remember we talked about last week that reason as a word is problematic because in English we only have one word for reason, whereas a lot of other languages have multiple words for different types of reasons. And there is the reason of the right brain and the reason that belongs to the left hemisphere. And that reason encapsulates both. But here we want to point out the role of intuition and imagination in ascertaining the truth. And I just want to share, there's so much that we could do with this, but I know we're sort of running out of time, both tonight and in terms of moving on to the next section of this magnificent work. So I just want to point out a couple of things about how science understands this. And Einstein is a great example of this. Intuition's power to produce insights. And by the way, he kind of goes through this very interesting thing that intuition is this sort of like eruption of seeing the whole of something rather than building from parts logically in order, right? And what that does is it creates an insight. And if you break down the word insight, it's sight from in, right? It's something that comes as a kind of unseen or immaterial connection to a whole, all right? So he said, intuition's power to produce insights that are very far from obvious functions to in our efforts to understand the most fundamental way the cosmos in which we live. Einstein's theory of relativity is, or certainly was, deeply counterintuitive, and yet he relied on intuition to guide him there. All great achievements, wrote Einstein, of science must start from intuitive knowledge. I believe in intuition and inspiration, he wrote. And this is a quote. At times I feel certain I am right while not knowing the reason. Imagination is more important than knowledge. It is, strictly speaking, a real factor in scientific research. And he goes on to articulate that for Einstein, he really relies heavily on music. His sister reports that, and this is something that he shared with the poet, George Viereck, I don't know who that is. I often think in music, he wrote. And his sister Maha reported that when working on a problem, he would play the piano and then get up saying, there, now I've got it. These were problems of math. These were problems of science, problems of intuiting how the cosmos works, right? He is said to have told the psychologist Max Wertheimer that he never thought in logical symbols or mathematical equations, but in images, feelings, and musical architecture. He called mathematics, quote, the poetry of logical ideas, an effort toward logical beauty, in which spiritual formulas are discovered necessary for the deeper penetration into the laws of nature. Now, if you're familiar with Einstein, none of that probably is a surprise to you. Einstein was a bit of a mystic, but not a weird mystic, right? He simply believed that the harmony of the cosmos and the way the cosmos worked wasn't simply figured out by pounding equations on the blackboard, but by a deep intuition, and music could connect him there, right? he also outlines in this chapter the degree to which beauty plays a role in equations. Mathematical equations are supposed to be beautiful. And he gives examples of times when the beauty of an equation is what leads to the development of it, and the proof of the equation is developed after the beauty. Okay? So intuition is a necessary aspect of science. And we could kind of go on with that, but let me see where else I wanted to go with this. So what separates insight of the right hemisphere from analysis of the left hemisphere is that insight is seen at once, not arrived at through a chain of distinct steps, but at once. By at once, I don't mean right away, because the insight might take a very long time to incubate. It may well involve recasting the problem in a host of different ways over long periods. But when it hatches, he writes, it is sudden. And it is, by all accounts, utterly convincing. Subliminal priming, cues of which we are unaware, they come to us from the unseen or the immaterial, can spark a later insight after a considerable incubation period. Now, someone would say, and I would say, realize that, of course, when you're talking about a mathematician allowing music or using music to develop at an insight, he's done the foundation work, right? It's not that someone who's never done high-end physics suddenly has an insight, mathematical insight in a beautiful equation from listening to music. We might feel something like that, but you have to have done the work, right? So this isn't, again, an either or. Either you use your left brain reason or your right brain reason. What he's saying is both are necessary, okay? So a scientist like Einstein is doing the work that later hatches into, and this is true of many great insights. How many of you, of course, Beautiful Mind is a great example of this. Have you seen the Beautiful Mind? And one of the things that John Nash said, this is not in the movie, but it's in an interview I read with John Nash, because the mystery of John Nash is that his insight into algorithms it came like a dream, right? It came at once. He kind of frittered away his PhD time. He was at Princeton, isn't that correct? Yeah. And then all of a sudden, there it was. And of course, then he developed all this paranoid, imaginary people and conspiracy theories and all kinds of stuff. Aliens. It got even weirder in real life than they showed it in the movie. And so an interviewer asked John Nash, how is it that you could have had this incredible insight that led to this mathematics of algorithms that's still being used extensively in technology today, probably in AI. I don't know what the relationship of Nash's work to AI is now, but how is it that you could have that, but also believe that UFOs were following you, and that you were at the center of a government conspiracy, and that these people, like you were imagining, fully fleshed people in your life that weren't real? And his reply was, because both those things came from the same place. In other words, he trusted the intuition that led to the algorithmic breakthrough for which he won the Nobel Prize, but the same feeling about the UFOs, it came from the same place for him. And that's very interesting. It's a very, just another example of how hard this is to nail down. Let me see what else I wanted to do tonight. Any questions? No? Okay. So let's then, let me see. I wanted to read something on 759. Yeah, this is more about beauty and mathematics. And for those of you who are engineers or who are involved in the sciences, beauty is a test of correctness that many mathematicians, philosophers, and scientists have experienced as a touchstone in their work. And so G.H. Hardy wrote in a work, A Mathematician's Apology, beauty is the first test. There is no permanent place in the world for ugly mathematics. I love that. Similarly, another mathematician wrote, the feeling of mathematical beauty, of the harmony of numbers and forms, and of geometric elegance is a real aesthetic feeling that all true mathematicians know. And this is the part of math that I'm very fascinated in. I don't have the background. I don't have the work that enables me to really do high-end mathematics. But that idea that mathematics is related to music and harmony and structure, but in a sense, in a divine, in a spiritual sense, I think is very, very fascinating. So anyway, so let's jump over then to some ideas of where we are more used to thinking of intuition and imagination, and that is in poetry. Um, and what I want to point out here is simply that this is a great quote from Shelley in his work, A Defense of Poetry, that talks about the creative process and where intuition comes from. So let me just read this. Poetry is not like reasoning, a power to be exerted according to the determination of the will. A man cannot say, I will compose poetry. The greatest poet even cannot say it. For the mind in creation is as a fading coal, which some invisible influence, like an inconstant wind, awakens to transitory brightness. This power arises from within, but when composition begins, inspiration is already on the decline. And the most glorious poetry that has ever been communicated to the world is probably a feeble shadow of the original conceptions of the poet. It's a very, very beautiful way of describing insight in poetic creation. It's not something to be grasped. It's not something you can control. You're not simply working the language. Although sometimes I saw an interview with Dr. Seuss about this. Has anyone seen this? Where Dr. Seuss's most famous sort of children's poems are these wildly inventive wordplay, and the interviewer said, "Well, where do you get this? Like, how do you get inspired?" And he's like, "Well, no, I just pull out the thesaurus and I start writing words down and I just start combining them." Right? And it was really disappointing for the interviewer because it was like, how do you think anyone does this work? I mean, you still have to do the work, but why not use a thesaurus to kind of say one thing a dozen times and have it be whimsical and delightful? But Shelley's talking about something else there, that poetry is a vision. Poetry is an insight. There's this sense of a coal that wind blows on, and it glows up a little bit. And then once you start composing the warmth of that, it starts to fade again. And you're almost working fast enough to kind of capture the magic that was there. And this is exactly the way a 17th century Japanese poet, Basho, writes. Once one's mind achieves a state of concentration and the space between oneself and the object has disappeared, there's that betweenness that McGilchrist is describing. The essential nature of the object can be perceived. Then, he says, express it immediately. If one ponders it, it will vanish from the mind. When you are composing a verse, quickly say what is in your mind. Never hesitate a moment. Composition must occur in an instant, like a swordsman leaping at his enemy. It's the same idea, right? That inspiration comes to a poet. What ends up on paper is usually a pale leftover of the true delight that was from within. And we have other examples. This is Thackeray about his fiction. I have been surprised at the observations made by some of my characters. It seems as if an occult power was moving the pen. The personage does or says something, and I ask, how the dickens did he come up with that? If you've ever written fiction, this is one sign that you're onto something good, is when what happens on page is a complete surprise to you, and your characters start speaking as if they had their own mind, and you're just recording it. And this is exactly how Dickens describes it. Some beneficent power shows it all to me and tempts me to be interested, and I don't invent it, really do not, but see it and write it down. And that's how Dickens describes his creative process. You get into this flow where it arises somehow and it doesn't feel like a product of your will. You're not willing it into existence. You're not controlling. This is why pedantic fiction feels like a sermon, because the writer is simply using the fiction to say what he wants to say. But good fiction is about creating characters that actually begin to speak on their own. And there seems to be this in-betweenness of reality in that creation. And this is very much a part. This is the connection that McGilchrist is saying. This isn't just poetry or fiction. This is what happens in mathematics, right? The tools are different. The poet and the fiction writer is using words, and the mathematician or the physicist is using numbers. But they're both creating something elegant that comes to mind in a sudden, in a very, very beautiful way. So this is what he means. And if I can just read, let me see what I want to do here. I wanted to mention this about Tolkien very quickly, and then the last thing, and then we'll be done, because we did start late. He mentions this about Tolkien in our attitude towards imagination. He says that, where was this? From the left hemisphere's point of view, imagination, like metaphor and myth, is a species of lying, okay? And he tells this story of J.R.R. Tolkien, who was a fellow of Merton College, of course, and one of his other colleagues, also a fellow of the college but a mathematician, was often irritated by the attention that Tolkien was getting from visitors, especially, of course, after The Lord of the Rings, even after The Hobbit, I'm sure. People would visit, and the guests would sort of fawn over Tolkien. And one day, it says, one day in the common room, yet another guest was introduced to the great man, Tolkien, and gushed, "Oh, Professor Tolkien, I do so admire your writing. It's so full of imagination." And it says the mathematician could bear it no longer, and from behind a newspaper in the lounge was heard to snort indignantly, "Imagination? Imagination! Made it all up!" Right? The mathematician's accusing the fiction writer of doing something that really isn't real, right? That's the point. And yet, Tolkien's whole use of metaphor and myth was about capturing what is real by imagination. To read, one of the reasons why people still read The Lord of the Rings is because even within the imaginative fairy story that is, it's not technically, if you follow McGilchrist's thinking on this, this is very interesting. It's not technically a fantasy, but it's a great work of imagination because it gives you glimpses and intimations of a reality that is partially revealed, but always partially hidden. And that's what makes it so compelling as fiction. Tolkien was very aware of the Christian themes that he interwove through his narrative, but unlike Lewis, who tended more towards allegory, Aslan equals Jesus, right? Aslan dies and is risen from the grave, right? Just like Jesus dies and is risen from the grave. For Tolkien, Tolkien hated that, and he was openly critical of Lewis's approach, because in Tolkien's work, there are Christological themes, but they're shared amongst many characters, and you're glimpsing different aspects of Christ in Gandalf, in Frodo, in Aragorn. It's not one person who is the Christ figure. It's multiple persons who round out a many-sided way of viewing the power of Christ, the Messiah, in redeeming the world. And so again, this is the kind of partially revealed and partially hidden evocation of the truth that makes you feel more in contact with reality for reading it, not less. It's not escapist fantasy. Now, he does point out, the reason I say that Tolkien, we can say, is not fantasy is he makes this point. Fantasy, a lot of the work that arises inspired by Tolkien, fantasy is projected full-blown from the workings of the mind. And in an imagination, rather, we experience intimations of matters that are glimpsed, only partly seen. Our conscious minds obscure them because they resist explicit formulation. So a lot of fantasy that isn't very good is about explicit formulations. It's again, it's formulaic, there's a lot of fantasy that's written, and a lot of it is very formulaic. Now, there's nothing wrong with that if you enjoy reading that, and that's a sort of escapist, whatever. But it's not quite what Tolkien was aiming for, and it's why Tolkien's greatness is there. As Tolkien understood that myth and metaphor, intuition and imagination are necessary for the comprehension of the fullness of reality and the fullness of what is true. And let me just read then in conclusion something that McGilchrist says. My contention is that imagination, far from deceiving us, is the only means whereby we experience reality. It is the place where our individual creative consciousness meets the creative cosmos as a whole. He points out it's no coincidence that the same Indo-European root present in classical Greek indicates both to know and to generate or to be born. To know and to generate or be born is essentially the same root word. It is the virtual represented world of the left hemisphere that is the deceit. Imagination is not, as it is sometimes conceived, the capacity to conjure the unreal, but for the first time to see the real that is, for reasons of deeply ingrained habit, no longer present to us. It is not a means of placing something else between us and the world, but of removing the accretions that prevent us from that world's fuller realization. To see, to get back to the words of Christ here, to see is not just to register sense data, but to see into the life of what is seen, and through it to the greater picture that lies beyond it, is implicit in it, and makes sense of it in terms of the totality of experience. So this is where we understand the spiritual life as a learning to see, as a learning to reconstitute and redevelop our powers of perspective, our powers of reception in humility, rooted in understanding that we don't see the whole. We are not in control of our lives, and that is okay. Right? Most of us will spend the rest of our lives wrestling that dragon. I'm not in control, and it's okay because I don't see the whole. And I attach my emotions to the partial, and I go flying off into hysteria because I don't see the whole. But imagination, and what we're saying is prayer, is what gives us this deeper vision, this deeper insight to see beyond the surface of things into the reality of things as a whole. And that will lead us into our next section. We're not going to meet next week because, of course, it's Thanksgiving. So there's no service on Wednesday night and no class. But when we come back in 2 weeks, then we will go on to volume 2 of McGilchrist and spend 2 sessions before Christmas talking about what then is true and going more deeply into intersections between his conclusions and our Orthodox understanding of reality. So it just kind of it's going to sort of accelerate now deeper into Orthodox material, and that will launch us into, after the Christmas break, the ethics of beauty by an Orthodox theologian, Dr. Timothy Petitsis, a work of, I believe, it's an important, very beautiful work of theology.